Cortland Simmons with you here at the CS Racing Report, recapping day 2 of the Breeders' Cup World Thoroughbred Championships from the great race place, Santa Anita Park in Arcadia, California. And what a great second day of racing on both turf and dirt at the Grade 1 championship level from the Arcadia Oval. Let's quickly get into race number 1. COVFEFE, trained by Brad Cox, who's on this meteoric rise as a hot young trainer, wins his 3rd career Breeders' Cup race already, capturing the filly and mare sprint with COVFEFE, who was the favorite, 3/4 of a length in front of Bellafina, who I thought was the X factor of the X factors going into this. Didn't know if she was wanting to deal with all this supersonic speed at this shortened distance, shortening up from the route races. Ran very well. COVFEFE and she, Bellafina, separated themselves from the rest of the field. She was 7 1/4 lengths in front of the Dawn Destroyer, who was a half length in front of Spice Perfection as they were in their own little scrum behind the top two. 22.13 for the quarter. 44.78 for the half, and then COVFEFE using the inside trip very well, about 3 paths out underneath Joel Rosario, was able to win in 122.40. Very impressive performance. That should secure a divisional championship, and I think everybody, myself, along with myself, is very interested to see what she's going to do should she stay in training in 2020. Very exciting performance by a very nice filly in COVFEFE. So she gets the day started off winning the filly and mare sprint, and then as we move along to the turf sprint, Stormy Liberal going for history, trying to make the three-peat happen for trainer Peter Miller, who had 3 in here. We all know he's been very effective in these sprint races. He's had a couple 1-2s in the Breeders' Cup, some 1-3s, so he has been very potent, and this time it certainly happened, and this was no different, but with different horses. It wasn't Stormy Liberal carrying the flag for Peter Miller in his barn this day. It was Belvoir Bay along with Alm. They, of course, dominated the action for Miller, finishing 1-2. Belvoir Bay winning by a length and a quarter over Alm, who was a nose in front of Shaky Shabazz, or Shiki Shabazz, with Stubbins 4th and Pure Sensation 5th. Final time after a brisk 21.47 first quarter. 54.83 for the 5 furlongs of the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. So Peter Miller wins another Breeders' Cup race. It escapes me how many career wins he has, but he has a very nice resume that he's building up. He seems to just be really an expert at getting these horses ready for these speed-driven races, and he does it once again with Belvoir Bay. A very nice win there. Then we get to the Dirt Mile. This is one of sort of the sub-co-features because of the return of Omaha Beach, because of Improbable, considered one of the top 3-year-olds who's had his struggles cutting back, because of Mr. Money, who won 4 graded stakes before his downfall. He met his Waterloo at the Pennsylvania Derby at that added distance of 1 1/8. After impressing in the West Virginia Derby, he was shortening up for Brett Calhoun and was taking in some good money. Then you had Cold Front for Todd Pletcher and some of these other horses like Giant Expectations shortening up. And in the end, the 3-year-olds did well in this race, but it wasn't who it was expected to be. In the winner's circle, Spun to Run, trained by Juan Guerrero, ridden by Irad Ortiz Jr., who we're going to be talking a lot about, who's red hot during this 2-day meet of the World Thoroughbred Championships. Had his program reconfigured after finishing a distant 3rd in the Haskell behind Maximum Security and Mucho Gusto. He was a well-beaten 5th in the Pennsylvania Derby. Juan Guerrero decided to basically reinvent this horse in a sense, and recalibrate things, put him in a minor stakes at Parks, the home of the PA Derby, and he took that form from Parks all the way out to the left coast and did extremely well, winning this race in 136.58, defeating Omaha Beach, who was caught, on the back end, coming from behind, which a lot of people were extremely surprised by. Mike Smith had his problems in this race, and that continued to be kind of the theme on this day, but people were surprised Omaha Beach was playing the role of not necessarily a stalk and pouncer, but a dead closer. That's how far behind, almost 10 lengths that he got, and he really didn't seem to be making as much progress as he needed to be with 3 furlongs out, but he finally got into the race, and just on class alone was able to finish 2nd, with Blue Chipper from Asia finishing a very respectable 3rd, very credible race. Snapper Sinclair for Steve Asmussen, Ricardo Santana Jr. aboard, was in there finishing 4th. So he ran a very good race, and Improbable disappointed again. Again, he's one of those horses that, there was a question as to his gate antics and everything like that, and whether he would show up. And it's apparent that, again, it's one of those case point scenarios. You don't shorten up in this race, even though it was a tough field to finish 5th and have some sort of excuse, because there really was none. On the turn, it was pretty clear that Improbable couldn't keep up. And now, of course, he's gone from being an enigma to a pretty sorry, excuse for a top thoroughbred at this point. But again, we'll talk more about him in the interim between the Breeders' Cup and the Eclipse Awards and the Pegasus and so forth. Spun to run, very impressive though. 23.05 were the early fractions, 46.51 for the half, and spun in the run, spun to run. Basically, won this race from gate to wire. I think that surprised a lot of people, but there were a lot of horses that were expected to be closer to him, that were expected to overtake. They just didn't hold up to their end of the bargain. And the 3-year-old wins this race, and it's a great feather in the cap for a 3-year-old. A lot of people didn't expect to win, to triumph in the Breeders' Cup. Spun to Run wins the Big Ass Fans Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. Then moving on to one of the races that would be considered to be one of the Coco features, a race that had Horse of the Year ramifications beyond divisional honors on the line, the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, sponsored by Maker's Mark. That race featuring Sister Charlie. Her story's been well told. 6 straight graded wins, most of them at the grade 1, the G1 level since 2018, when she triumphed in this same race to capture and secure a championship. She was coming in as a prohibitive favorite against a pretty good field. Some people thought that the field wasn't as good, but I thought that actually, when you really broke it down, minus Magical, Contemporary of Enable, second in the Eclipse Stakes, had won the Champion Stakes at Newmarket 2 weeks before this, spiked the temperature, not only was taken out of, withdrawn from consideration of running in this race or the Breeders' Cup Turf against the Colts, but was unfortunately retired. And if you haven't heard the news, Enable will come back in 2020 for Frankie Dettori and the jockey and trainer John Gosden. And they, of course, had their own little mini Enable in here in Fanny Logan, a horse who was getting a lot of buzz for trainer John Gosden and Frankie Dettori, who would ride the horse. And in the end, it turned out to be a race in which Iridessa, again, Aidan O'Brien, the trainer of Magical, couldn't, make the trip. And then Fleeting, a horse who would run very well in the Epsom Oaks, also out of the O'Brien stable, also had to be scratched. So in sense, it seemed to be the cards were lining and the stars were lining up for Sister Charlie, not only on paper, but with these defections. And so going in, it was expected that she would win. Well, that's the beauty of the Breeders' Cup. Anything can happen. And Iridessa, a horse that was highly regarded, actually, another one of the O'Briens, but this horse was trained by Joseph O'Brien, the son of Aidan O'Brien, who, as we all know, won the 2010 Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf with St. Nicholas Abbey. A fine rider, but a little bit on the tall side, and of course his weight precluded him from being able to be a full-time jockey. So what's the next best thing? Become a trainer, and what better hands could you be in than being a son of Aidan O'Brien? He wins the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, a great story for him. She wins it by a neck over Vasilika, who was coming in as an underrated contender in here off the Rodeo Drive, the local prep at Santa Anita. She was 2 1/4 lengths in front of Sister Charlie, who was 3/4 of a length in front of the Ballyhooed or the Buzz horse and Fanny Logan with Just Wonderful, another O'Brien, Aidan O'Brien trainee, finishing 5th. But a great day for the O'Briens in the sense that the native son, the prodigal son, was able to win this race. Look at the fractions for this race. 23.45, 46.45 for the half, 109.68 for the 3/4. Final clocking for the 1 1/4, 157.77. Now that, my friends, a 157.77, that is some serious running right there, no matter what surface it is, for Iridessa, Vasilika, and Sister Charlie to produce in a race of this caliber. But it is the Breeders' Cup World Thoroughbred Championships, and this was definitely championship type stuff here in the Maker's Mark Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, won by Iridessa in an upset over Sister Charlie. And this, of course, pretty much eliminates her from being Horse of the Year, considering that some of her top contenders didn't even run in this race. So again, Iridessa the winner of that. Then as we move on to some of the other races in this beautiful Breeders' Cup is the Breeders' Cup Sprint. This was considered by many people to also have Horse of the Year ramifications and considered to be arguably the best race pound for pound from top to bottom on the card. Unfortunately, Imperial Hint had to be scratched, so that still left a great field in here. And in the end, after a 21.47 brisk first quarter, in the stretch run, about 3 wide in a pretty good spot on the racetrack, it was Mitole running down the very, very game Chance-A-Lot, who had lost a heartbreaker to Omaha Beach at 6 furlongs in the Santa Anita Sprint Championship at the home of the Breeders' Cup. He was winging on the front end. He was holding on gamely, actually was really spurting away from the rest of the field, running very, very strongly, but MITOLE was just a little bit stronger in the end, winning by a length and a quarter. Chancelot was 2¼ lengths in front of Whitmore, who put in a very good race. I thought his best days against this kind of company might be behind him, but Ron Moquette did a great job to get him in a position to finish third. He was a half length in front of Engage, who ran very, very well for Steve Asmussen. So Asmussen trained the number 1 and the number 4 in this race for his great connections and Ricardo Santana Jr. in the irons. Firenze Fire finished 5th in this race. And again, Hog Creek Hustle was a horse that I thought would run well. He finished 6th. And Catalina Cruiser was in over his head. I thought this could be a little problematic, although, as you guys know in the preview pod, I did have him, along with Hog Creek Hustle, as one of the ones that could pick up the pieces and win this race. Certainly did not happen. It was the stalk and pouncers. MITOLE was a little bit off of the pace. He has a tendency to be a little bit forwardly placed, but Ricardo Santana Jr. played it smart and was able to run down Chancelot. It was a very risky proposition because Chancelot is a serious racehorse, folks, and he ran a very, very nice race. He and MITOLE were pretty much the class of this race, but give Whitmore credit. He ran very, very well. Final time for this race at the 6 was 109 flat for MITOLE, who certainly puts his name in the hat for Horse of the Year. The only thing that really is the downside or the black mark on his record was that roasting in the Alfred G. Vanderbilt, where he basically got sucked into a black hole and got vaporized by Imperial Hint, who missed this race. So he didn't get a chance to exact revenge on Imperial Hint, and who's to say whether he would have had Imperial Hint been in there. But it's no fault of the connections in MITOLE himself that Imperial Hint wasn't able to make it to the starting gate. For the horses that were out there, he was able to conquer them all and win this Breeders' Cup Sprint very impressively over a very, very tough Chancelot in 109 flat. Then moving on to the Breeders' Cup Mile on the turf. A lot of, interesting horses in here. It's one of the harder races to handicap, but in the end, as Larry Comas called it, with the 16th to go, the girls are taking over, and that's exactly what they did, as Uni and Got Stormy, horses that have been very good and great at competition. Got Stormy had beaten Colts earlier in the year, put on a show against the males, dominating this race. Uni was able to outkick what was virtually a sprint down for the last furlongs, the last 16th, by a length and a half. Got Stormy was a length and a quarter in front of Without Parole, who was a nose in front of Circus Maximus out of the O'Brien barn under Ryan Moore. Just an exciting performance, a very innovating effort by both of these horses as they produce some serious afterburners in the stretch, as Chad Brown described, and I thought he accurately did so. Uni kind of reminds you a little bit of Megahertz, and you know what? You might as well throw Mark Cassie's Got Stormy in that category too. Just two explosive fillies, and what I'm curious about is if they could have that form, either going a mile or a little bit added distance or short on the dirt against fillies and perhaps against Colt, as fast as these horses, the way they outran these Colts, you could, put that proposition on the table as well, in addition to the possibility of these horses running in Europe, where the mile is a very important part of the race program over there with all the grade 1s and strong grade 2s. I'd be very curious to see whether it's against females or males, how they would do over there. And certainly stay tuned, because that certainly could be a possibility, as Uni gets the win in 132.45 for the flat mile. Just a sparkling time in beating a very, very, very solid Got Stormy in this Breeders' Cup dirt mile. Just a fantastic performance by those two. In the Breeders' Cup Distaff, another one of those Coco features in which Horse of the Year on the line for Midnight Bisou, 7 of 7, but she was coming in here in the Distaff at 9 furlongs against probably her toughest opposition. They decided, the connections headed by Jeff Bloom, to not try the Colts to try to win Horse of the Year. They wanted to go the Azaria route, which was to try to beat the best of the fillies, not take their chances at a distance that they finally have conquered, the 1.1 miles. That's what was all lined up for Midnight Bisou to do under Mike Smith, and in the end, that is not what happened in this race. She got stuck in a little bit of traffic, really kind of got a little further behind than what was expected. Again, Mike Smith having continued troubles with judging where this horse needed to be. She was not in that typical stalk and pounce position, as Larry Comas called it. She was basically had some work to do on the turn, and that is a mistake, or certainly a risk that can end up costing you in the end. And Blue Prize, at that same time, at that same relative moment, was picking up horses one by one, ended up being able, with Joe Bravo aboard, to slide into about the 3 path, which was a great spot for her as she was moving and accelerating very, very nicely. Midnight Bisou did, on class alone, was able, after getting, not necessarily a bad trip, but a bad ride that contributed to maybe not a not so perfect trip or not ideal experience, was able to make, more than inches. She was making up yards, and it looked like for a moment she was not only threatening to get to Blue Prize but go by her, but Blue Prize kicked into another gear in a glorious performance, winning in 150.50 for the mile and an eighth, pulled away, almost won it by 2, 22.98. After those were the fractions, 46.68 as Sari Getty Empress held on gamely for third. She was setting those fractions, 110.8 through 3 for the 3 quarters, and this is when in earnest the race began, and that's when Blue Prize started to pick him up and lay him down. She had already knocked off and had slayed a few dragons on the turn, and she just ran a fantastic race, and it'll be interesting to see while she's up for sale at Keeneland, if she's going to either be a broodmare or if they keep her in training. There's been talk that Ignacio Correas, who got his first Breeders' Cup win, by the way, would stay as the trainer, but that'll be a story to stay tuned to. But Blue Prize was very impressive, and you know what? When you look at her resume, it's not half bad, beating both Enable and beating Midnight Bisou, the top 2 fillies in the minds of many, in her last 2 starts. So why not her? Why can't you consider her to be, top handicap female? It's a thought. I think that in the end, Midnight Bisou was going to win the award. She probably had it sealed up. She was really going for Horse of the Year, but I think her chances of capturing that have probably been seriously compromised, although I did say in the preview pod that she still could be a Horse of the Year candidate, even if she finished 5th, simply because what I thought could happen is that Bricks and Mortar and some of these other horses might not come through. But Blue Prize wins the Longines Breeders' Cup Distaff, with Jersey Joe Bravo aboard, getting his first Breeders' Cup win. Just a fantastic performance by her. Moving on to the Breeders' Cup Turf, another one of the Coco features, one of the Coco features for Horse of the Year. Of course, Bricks and Mortar, undefeated in 2019, going a mile and a half for the first time. Would he represent the possibility of being a Horse of the Year that would really fit the profile in the glory years, in which horses that generally captured thoroughbred racing's top honor had proven themselves not only at a mile and a quarter multiple times, but at the mile and a half distance, and way back when the Jockey Club Gold Cup, which was the championship race, was run at 2 miles. In the subsequent years, it was reduced to a mile and a half, but still a very legitimate championship was usually on the line in races like that, and usually those top horses would solidify their resume by winning a race like the Gold Cup, even at the mile and a half, so horses like Affirmed and so forth. So that is something that is a lost art nowadays, with the Breeders' Cup Classic considered to be the standard at only a mile and a quarter. But Bricks and Mortar, going 12 furlongs for the first time, was able to make his move after being covered up in the early going. Was a little bit in tight, according to Irad Ortiz Jr. Got a little bit unsteadied, a little bit, started picking it up on the back stretch, got about 4 wide in the stretch, was able to angle in, get a little bit better trip. Anthony Van Dyke had the best trip, although in the end he was trying to split horses, although he was already inside for Ryan Moore. So the belief that he was a little compromised, I'm not buying into it 150% like everyone else. I think he had a little trouble, but he had a little bit better trip. He just didn't have the afterburners that Bricks and Mortar did, coming on the outside, did in order to win this race. And look at the splits, folks. It was slow, 24.81, 48.44, 113.26 for the quarter, the half, and the 3 quarters, 137.91. That is a slow pace, and even on turf, for a horse to be able to close into a pace scenario that is that tepid is very, very impressive, because look at the final time. Very similar to a European race, but this time is really off the charts, because as weight races have a tendency to go slow and then quicken, particularly in Europe, you're very, very hard pressed to get this kind of time. 224.73 for the 12 furlongs. That, my friends, is some supersonic stuff right there that Bricks and Mortar was able to generate in beating a very game United. He ran very, very well, and it wasn't until the final few jumps that Bricks and Mortar was able to get by. United did not throw in the towel. Bricks and Mortar wins it by a head in that 224.73, with United 1 1/4 lengths in front of the Epsom Derby winner, Anthony Van Dyke, who, as I said before, he didn't really have a legitimate excuse. He was a half length in front of Zulu Alpha. Again, 224.73. You could couldn't be more impressed, whether you were, overwhelmingly in love with bricks or mortar coming into this race or not. As Chad Brown said, and I agree with him, he and Irad Ortiz Jr. are really sort of the stars amongst the stars, said in the post-race interview, as far as horse of the year goes, it's a no-brainer, and I think that I would have to concur with him on this. Great performance in the Longines Breeders' Cup Turf by Bricks and Mortar, winning it by a head over United in 224.73, and he looks like the logical choice for 2019 Horse of the Year, as well as handicap champion, and maybe even as well as handicap turf champion. He'll certainly get the turf championship, may even get the overall handicap crown as well, but certainly Horse of the Year is looking very, very good for him. And then to cap off what had already been a great day, we get into the Longines Breeders' Cup Classic, $6 million. Had 11 horses going in this race. Code of Honor was coming in, highly regarded. You had Owendale, a horse that I was pushing Brad Cox to run, even though he had, run fifth in the Travers. Didn't think it was a bad run. He had won the Oklahoma Derby coming in. He had Math Wizard, the upset winner of the Pennsylvania Derby, in here. You had Seeking the Soul trying to get off the ground after being knocked down a couple times and being disappointing after being a runner-up in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile at Churchill in 2018. Hadn't done as well at the mile and an eighth and the mile and a quarter in his races out in California and trying to prepare for the Breeders' Cup. He had War of Will, the Preakness winner. People were buzzing about Yoshida. Elate, the filly, was trying to duplicate what Zenyatta did 10 years ago, to step into the history books to join her as the second filly to win the Breeders' Cup Classic against males. And you had, of course, she's a stablemate of Yoshida. And then, of course, you had McKenzie, his heartfelt story being named after one of Bob Baffert's dear friends, Brad McKenzie, one of the great executives in thoroughbred racing, a great friend of Baffert's. When they met at the University of Arizona, they had a long history before his passing, and that's who this horse was named after. Again, McKenzie had not put two graded stakes wins in a row together, had been drilled in the Awesome Again, the local prep by Mongolian Groom, who was in here. So you had a lot of different horses in here. In the end, it turned out to be somewhat like what happened when the Breeders' Cup was last hosted in 2016, a two-horse race. Not quite up to that Sunday Silence, Easy Goer, Affirmed Alidar. It wasn't up to that level, or last but not least, that 2016 Classic between Arrogate and California Crum. It did not rise to that level, but it was still pretty dramatic as McKenzie made his move and separated himself from the field, and as Jerry Bailey aptly described it, looked like he was going to spurt away, but when he didn't do that, Vino Rosso, who was making his move on the turn after utilizing stalk and pounce tactics in a race in which it's set up where he didn't have to be on the front end like he was in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, was starting to make his move slowly but surely, making up inches, not yards. And then all of a sudden, as time went on, Vino Rosso kept getting better and better, started to accelerate a little bit more, grinding this victory out, getting by McKenzie, winning by 4 1/4 lengths in 2:02.80. McKenzie was 4 1/4 lengths in front of Higher Power, who was one of the picks that I thought would do very well. He was one of my win bets off that strong performance in the Pacific Classic. The Awesome Again, a little bit of a throwout even before he missed the break, simply because the mile and an eighth I don't think is as good a setup for him. But again, the top two separated themselves, and certainly you can make the case that Vino Rosso separated himself from the runner-up, but collectively, McKenzie was well ahead of the third, and of course, Higher Power finished in front of Elate, who finished fourth. Some of the disappointments in here, obviously Code of Honor didn't run well, and Vino Rosso exacted his revenge in this Breeders' Cup Classic, and how he finished seventh, Code of Honor. You had Yoshida, just never factored in. I didn't think the mile and a quarter would suit him. He finished eighth. War of Will, the Preakness winner, was ninth. Owendale, a big disappointment, finishing 10th. So, Math Wizard did run a respectable fifth, and Seeking the Soul was sixth. But a lot of disappointments, and that's part of the Breeders' Cup. There's that thrill of victory, and then there's the disappointment, the despair, and falling into the abyss in a dark dungeon that describes that is adjectives for the agony of defeat, as Jim McKay described it. And that's what happened here. But for the connections of Vino Rosso, this is definitely, sweet redemption for being much maligned, myself included, along with other fans and journalists, that he's been a horse that's been a little up and down. But I still will ask the question that I asked before the Classic, the burning question: can he duplicate what he did in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, even though he was disqualified? That was a top-notch performance, and because he had won the Gold Cup at Santa Anita, you had to wonder, can he duplicate, or the performance at Belmont, which was better than the one at Santa Anita, in the Breeders' Cup against a better field. And that was one of the question marks that I had posed toward VINO Rosso. Not that he will answer the question, he can't talk, but I think we all put it out there. Could he duplicate that performance? Is it the new VINO Rosso, or is it a horse that he's going to, continue to create or continue in the pattern that he's always had, where you can't always trust him more than one race in a row, what he's going to do. He's unpredictable. And this time he was able to sort of equal the performance that he had in the Gold Cup. I think it definitely, given that these horses did not handle the track that well, or they just couldn't handle the distance, in which I think it's more of the latter than the track surface, which I do think is playing like one of the Eastern tracks. I'm going to pinpoint which one I think it mirrors, whether it comes out of the mouths of trainers or just trying by looking at video, which one I think it is similar to, if not an absolute carbon copy. No question about it that in this race, VINO Rosso was able to, if not duplicate the Jockey Club Gold Cup, certainly he was on a par, if not better, probably a little better than he was when he won the Gold Cup at Santa Anita early in the year. No question, he and McKenzie separated themselves, and he was able to spurt away from McKenzie in the end. Some will say that what we saw was McKenzie confirming what a lot of people thought, that he maybe can't get the mile and a quarter. I think that maybe the move on him, not to mention Joel Rosario hit him a few times, and we all know that McKenzie swishes his tail. He doesn't like to be hit. So that's maybe something that was lost on Joel Rosario in the heat of the moment, in the intense battle of the stretch of a Breeders' Cup Classic. But a great performance for VINO Rosso to win by 4 1/4. McKenzie again 4 1/4 lengths in front of the John Sadler trained Higher Power. And Elate, the filly, finished 4th in her final race for trainer Bill Mott. She'll be retired and sold at the Keeneland sale. But overall, a great Breeders' Cup. A lot of great storylines. Brittany Urton, one of the great broadcasts, one of the part of the NBC broadcast team, who also doubles up with TVG. Her father, of course, won a Breeders' Cup race on day one. You got Chad Brown and Irad Ortiz combining to win a couple of Breeders' Cup races. Chad Brown also teamed up with Irad's brother Jose to win a race on day one. Just a lot of great storylines. The little guys, like the connections to Spun to Run and so forth, winning a race on Breeders' Cup Day. And so there were a lot of really great things, some interesting upsets, some formful races. Overall, a very, very good Breeders' Cup that on paper, or it seemed like there didn't seem to be that sizzle, but things really got hot out in Arcadia, California. We're certainly going to talk a lot more about where the contenders for Horse of the Year stand in the midst of the races leading up to the Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays. There'll be some top-graded stakes races. We'll be covering those races along with a bit of recap on how all this shakes out, the Breeders' Cup World Thoroughbred Championships, right here at the CS Racing Report.